Three bullets. Three 60-ton Tiger tanks bearing down through the morning mist. 300 yards of frozen German mud between survival and annihilation. And the man behind the gun had never fired artillery in his life. But before we get to that moment, before we understand how a Kansas tractor mechanic became the most unlikely gunner in World War II, we need to go back. Back to a farm where a young man learned that every machine, no matter how complex, is just a collection of simple parts waiting to be understood. If you want to hear stories like this, stories about ordinary men doing extraordinary things when the world demanded it, hit that subscribe button. Because what you're about to hear isn't just history. It's a masterclass in human adaptation under pressure. November 17, 1944, 6:30 in the morning. Sergeant William Kowalski crouched in a crater outside a nameless German ridge, his breath turning to mist in the freezing air. His hands were shaking, but not from the cold. Through mud-splattered binoculars, he watched the eastern tree line. That dark wall of pine looked innocent enough to a civilian. But Kowalski wasn't a civilian. He was a dog face, a grunt with the 1st Infantry Division. And he knew that forest wasn't empty. It was waiting. What waited inside those trees wasn't just men with rifles. It was something heavier. Something that made the ground tremble before you even saw it. Kowalski lowered the binoculars and looked at his platoon. They were a mess. 23 men who looked less like soldiers and more like refugees who had stolen weapons. Their uniforms were caked in mud so thick it had dried into a kind of natural armor. Their eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, staring at nothing in particular. They were down to half strength. No radio contact with headquarters. No artillery support. And worst of all, no tanks. The Shermans that had been supporting their advance had been chewed up and spit out 2 days ago. They were alone on a ridge in enemy territory, and the silence was heavy enough to crush a man's chest. To understand why William Kowalski was sweating in freezing temperatures, you have to understand the weapon that had put him there. The war in Europe wasn't just a fight between men. It was a fight between machines. And for 3 years, the undisputed heavyweight champion of that fight was a weapon the Germans called the 88, the 88. To the history books, it was the Flak 36 anti-aircraft gun. To the men on the ground, it was simply the boogeyman, the thing that lived in nightmares. It was a weapon that wasn't supposed to exist, a piece of engineering that broke all the rules of fairness. The 88 was originally designed to shoot down airplanes. It was a sky gun. It fired a shell the size of a man's thigh into the stratosphere to knock bombers out of the clouds. To do that, German engineers had given it a barrel long enough to be a telephone pole and a powder charge that could accelerate a piece of steel to supersonic speeds in the blink of an eye. It was a precise, delicate instrument of high-altitude murder. But somewhere in the deserts of North Africa in 1941, a desperate German commander looked at his anti-aircraft guns, then looked at British tanks charging his line, and had a crazy idea. He lowered the barrel. He pointed the sky gun at the ground. The result was the military equivalent of using a sledgehammer to kill a Flemme. When an 88mm shell hit a tank, it didn't just punch a hole. It hit with such catastrophic violence that it often blew the turret clean off the hull. It turned armored vehicles into scrap metal and brave crews into memories. It could kill a tank from 2 miles away long before the tank crew even knew they were in a fight. You could hide from a machine gun. You could dig a hole to escape a mortar. But if an 88 could see you, you were already dead. And now, in a twist of fate that felt like divine intervention or cosmic joke, depending on your perspective, Sergeant Kowalski was sitting on top of a battery of them. But let's rewind, because to understand how Kowalski ended up in that German gun pit, we need to understand who he was before the war turned him into something else. Garden City, Kansas, 1938. William Kowalski was 14 years old, standing in Henderson's wheat field, staring at a broken John Deere Model A tractor that had defeated 3 professional mechanics. The machine sat there like a monument to mechanical failure, its engine silent, its purpose denied. Farmer Henderson had already spent a week's profit trying to fix it. 3 different mechanics had declared it dead, insisting he needed to replace the entire engine block. That was money Henderson didn't have. The wheat was ready for harvest. Time was running out. The tractor was worthless. Kowalski's father, Stefan, had brought his son to look at the machine. Stefan was a Polish immigrant, a coal miner with hands like iron, and a philosophy about machines that he'd learned in the old country. He stood next to the tractor, one weathered hand resting on the cold metal, and looked at his son. "Billy," he said in that thick accent that would never quite leave him. "Listen to me. Machines are not magic. They are steel gears, pistons. If you understand what a tool does, you can fix it. You don't need to read German or Latin. You just need to know how it works." Young Kowalski nodded, but he wasn't sure he believed it. The tractor looked impossibly complex. Pipes and valves and chambers that seemed to serve no purpose he could identify. The mechanics had opened it up, poked around, and given up. What could a 14-year-old kid do that professionals couldn't? But his father had already walked away, leaving him alone with the machine. Kowalski spent 2 days with that tractor. Not trying to fix it at first, just listening to it. He'd turn the crank, hear the dry grind of metal on metal. He'd trace fuel lines with his fingers, feeling where liquid should flow, but didn't. He'd peer into chambers with a flashlight, looking for anything out of place. The professionals had been looking for catastrophic failure, a cracked block, a seized piston, something big and obvious that would justify replacement. But Kowalski was looking for something else. He was looking for what was wrong, not what should be wrong. On the third day, he found it. The timing gear, the small mechanical heart that synchronized the engine's rhythm, was misaligned by exactly 2 millimeters. Just 2 millimeters. Less than the width of a pencil lead. The professionals had missed it because they weren't looking for something so small. They were looking for a reason to sell a new engine. Kowalski fixed it in 3 hours with 75 cents worth of parts. One new bolt. Some grease. Patience. The tractor roared to life like it had never been sick. Henderson harvested his wheat on time. He tried to pay Kowalski, but the boy's father refused the money. "He didn't do it for pay," Stefan said. "He did it to learn, and what he learned is worth more than your money." That lesson, that moment of understanding that complexity is just simplicity hidden behind intimidation that would save Kowalski's life 6 years later on a frozen ridge in Germany. But he didn't know that yet. December 8th, 1941, the day after Pearl Harbor. Kowalski was 17, technically too young to enlist without parental consent. His father signed the papers without hesitation. "They will teach you about machines," Stefan said. "Big machines. And someone has to stop those bastards." The Army assigned him to the 1st Infantry Division Company, C, 2nd Battalion. During basic training, he ranked 47th out of 120 soldiers in marksmanship. Perfectly average, unremarkable. But when a Jeep broke down, when a radio stopped working, when a machine gun jammed at the worst possible moment, Kowalski was the one they called. His platoon nicknamed him Wrench. By October 1944, after campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and France, Kowalski had seen enough war to last 10 lifetimes. He'd lost friends to bullets, artillery disease, and bad luck. But there was one loss that haunted him more than the others. October 28, 1944, 3 weeks before the day that would define his life. The 1st Infantry Division was grinding through the Hürtgen Forest, a nightmare of mud mines and German defensive positions that turned every 100 yards into a separate battle. Kowalski's best friend was Private First Class Michael Cordero, a kid from Brooklyn who never stopped talking and never stopped smiling. Mickey, everyone called him. Mickey was a gunner in a Sherman tank, part of the armored support that was supposed to make infantry assaults survivable. That morning, Mickey's tank was advancing through a narrow forest road when the 88 opened up. Kowalski was 200 yards away, close enough to hear everything, too far away to help. The sound of the 88 wasn't like other guns. It was a sharp report, a physical slap of displaced air that you felt in your chest cavity. The German gunners were hidden somewhere in the dense forest, firing from concealment at American armor that couldn't see them, couldn't hide, couldn't fight back. Mickey's Sherman took the first round through the frontal armor. That should have been impossible. Sherman armor was supposed to stop most German guns at range. But the 88 didn't care about supposed to. The shell punched through the steel like it was cardboard, carrying all its kinetic energy into the cramped fighting compartment where 5 men were packed together. Kowalski heard Mickey's voice over the radio. Ned heard it turn from professional calm to pure terror in the space of a heartbeat. "Contact front, we're hit, we're..." And then the ammunition cooked off. 20 shells inside the tank ignited simultaneously. The Sherman didn't just explode, it erupted. The turret, all 11 tons of it, lifted into the air on a pillar of flame and crashed down 30 feet away. The hull burned with a white-hot intensity, that made it impossible to look at directly. Kowalski ran toward the tank anyway. He made it 20 yards before the heat wall stopped him, before the secondary explosions threw shrapnel in every direction, before his sergeant tackled him to the ground and held him there while he screamed Mickey's name into the mud. Later, after the fire had burned itself out, after the metal had cooled enough to approach, they found Mickey's dog tags. One of them had melted the metal warped by heat into something that barely resembled its original shape. Kowalski took both tags, wrapped them in a piece of cloth, and put them in his breast pocket. He didn't pray. He didn't cry. He just made a promise to a dead friend. "I'll find a way to kill that gun," he whispered to the smoking wreck, "even if I have to learn how to fire the damn thing myself." It was a ridiculous promise. Impossible. Infantry sergeants don't operate artillery. They don't hunt down specific German positions for revenge. They follow orders, complete missions, try to survive until the next day. Personal vendettas are for movies, not for real war. But Kowalski kept that promise in his heart, like a coal that wouldn't stop burning. And 3 weeks later, fate would give him the opportunity to make good on it in a way he never could have imagined. From that day forward, Kowalski carried something else in his pack: a technical manual for the flak 3688mm anti-aircraft gun taken from a German prisoner. He couldn't read German, the text was useless to him, but the diagrams, the mechanical drawings, the cross-sections showing how the weapon functioned, those he studied every night by flashlight. His platoon thought he was crazy. "What are you going to do, wrench?" they'd joke. "Capture one and shoot it at them." They laughed. Kowalski didn't. He just kept studying the diagrams, memorizing the shape of parts he'd never touched, learning the language of a machine he'd never operated. November 17, 1944. 0300 hours. 3:30 in the morning. The order came down from Battalion Take Ridge 319. Intelligence said it was lightly defended. 4 to 6 German infantry guards protecting an artillery observation post. Should be a quick operation. In and out before dawn. Intelligence was wrong. Ridge 319 wasn't an observation post. It was a primary firing position for a Luftwaffe anti-aircraft battery. 4 flak 36 88mm guns, complete cruise ammunition stocks, and a dozen veterans who had been shooting down Allied bombers for 3 years. They knew their weapons the way a concert pianist knows their instrument. But Kowalski's platoon didn't know any of that when they started their approach through the pre-dawn darkness. 23 men moving in silence through frozen mud, their breath controlled, their movements practiced. They'd done this 100 times before. Clear the position. Hold until support arrives. Try not to die. The assault lasted 5 minutes. It was close quarters brutality, the kind of fighting that doesn't make it into the heroic accounts. Grenades thrown into dugouts. Bayonets used in the dark when bullets might hit your own men. The wet sound of steel entering flesh. The desperate gasps of men realizing they're dying. Kowalski killed 2 Germans that night with his bayonet. He'd shot men before, lobbed grenades into positions called artillery, down on coordinates. But this was different. This was intimate. He felt the resistance of the blade, heard the choking sounds, smelled the copper scent of blood mixing with cordite smoke. When it was over, 12 Germans were dead. 8 had escaped into the forest, running without their weapons, choosing survival over duty. 3 Americans were wounded but alive. And as the sun began to rise, casting weak November light over the position, Kowalski saw what they'd captured: 4 pristine 88mm anti-aircraft guns. They sat in sandbagged positions, their long barrels pointed at the sky, waiting for bombers that would never come. They were beautiful in a terrible way, painted in camouflage patterns of ambush yellow and forest green. They looked sleek, dangerous, expensive. They looked like instruments of precision death. Kowalski approached the nearest guns slowly, almost reverently. His platoon was securing the perimeter, checking bodies, treating wounded. But he was drawn to the weapon like a man in a trance. He reached out and touched the cold steel of the barrel. It was massive, thick enough that he couldn't wrap his arms around it. He walked to the breech, that huge block of machined steel that sealed the rear of the gun. It looked like a bank vault door covered in German text he couldn't read, and mechanical components he half recognized from his nightly study sessions. He ran his fingers over the metal, feeling the precision of German engineering. And then he saw it. Carved into the gun shield just above the traverse wheel, a name: Wolfstrain, Wolf's Tears, and below it tally marks, small vertical lines grouped in 5s. He counted them twice to be sure. 47 marks. This gun had destroyed 47 Allied vehicles, 47 crews, somewhere between 200 and 300 men killed by this single weapon. And one of those marks, one of those anonymous tallies, was Mickey Cordero's Sherman tank. Kowalski's hands began to shake. Not from cold, not from fear, from recognition. From the universe delivering exactly what he'd asked for in that desperate promise 3 weeks ago. Here was the weapon. Here was the gun that had haunted him. And it was his, now captured, waiting. Corporal Eddie Sullivan walked up beside him. Sullivan was a veteran of North Africa, a practical man who'd seen every flavor of combat and survived by never taking unnecessary risks. He looked at the 4 guns, then at Kowalski, and shook his head. "Beautiful, aren't they?" Sullivan said. "Completely useless to us, but beautiful. Like capturing a Stradivarius when you can't play violin." "Why useless?" Kowalski asked, though he already knew the answer. "Wrench, these things need a crew of 10 specialists to operate. You need a fire control computer. You need ballistic tables. You need guys who had trained for months on the optical sights and elevation mechanisms. We're infantry. We can't even read the German instructions." Sullivan was right, of course. The 88 was a scientific instrument. It had been designed by professors for professionals. Every dial, every gauge, every calculation was optimized for the complex problem of hitting aircraft moving at 200 miles per hour, 3 miles up. Using it required trigonometry, physics, and intimate familiarity with equipment that looked like it belonged in a laboratory. But as Kowalski stood there, his hand on the cold steel, he remembered his father's words from that wheat field in Kansas. "Machines are not magic. They are steel gears, pistons. If you understand what a tool does, you can fix it. If you understand what a tool does, not how it's supposed to be used, what it does." An 88 millimeter gun did one thing. It threw a very large piece of metal very fast in whatever direction the barrel was pointing. Everything else, all the complex calculations and optical sights and fire control systems, those were just fancy ways of pointing the barrel in the right direction. Kowalski didn't say any of this out loud. Sullivan would have thought he was crazy. Hell, he thought he was crazy. But the seed of an idea was planted. At 0630, exactly 3 hours after they'd secured the ridge, the sound started. It began as a vibration in the ground, a low-frequency rumble that you felt in your gut rather than heard with your ears. Then came the mechanical screech, that distinctive metal-on-metal grind of tank tracks on frozen earth. Every man on the ridge froze. Heads turned toward the eastern tree line. They all knew that sound. They'd all heard it before in nightmares and waking hours. It was the sound of German armor. Private Tommy Briggs, a 19-year-old kid from Texas who'd been in country for 6 weeks, stopped eating his sea ration. He looked at Kowalski with eyes that were too young to hold that much fear. "Sarge," Tommy whispered, "that's tanks." Kowalski raised his binoculars and scanned the tree line. For a long moment he saw nothing, just dark pines and morning mist. Then the first tree fell. It didn't just fall. It was pushed over 100-foot-tall pine, toppling sideways as something massive shoved through the forest. A shape emerged from the shadows. Boxy, angular, coated in textured anti-magnetic paste that made it look like the hide of some prehistoric beast. And mounted on the front, that long gun barrel with its distinctive muzzle brake. Tiger. Then another shape appeared 30 yards to the left. Another tiger. And then a third completing in a wedge formation that was designed for exactly one purpose: hunting. They were moving at 15 miles per hour, their hulls rocking gently as they crushed undergrowth. They weren't rushing. They weren't worried. They knew the Americans on that ridge had no armor support. They knew the Americans had no anti-tank weapons that could hurt them at range. They were coming to sweep the trash off their hill and reclaim their guns. Sullivan appeared at Kowalski's shoulder, breathing hard. "We need to retreat, right now. We can make the river if we move fast." Kowalski lowered the binoculars. He looked at the 1,200 yards of open terrain between the ridge and the river. Flat ground, no cover. He imagined his 23 men running across that field, while Tiger tanks, each mounting a coaxial machine gun and a whole machine gun, cut them down from range. "If we run," Kowalski said quietly, "we just die tired. They'll gun us down before we make it halfway." "Then what the hell do we do? We've got 2 bazooka rockets left." 2. And those things need to hit tigers from 50 yards to do any damage. That's suicide range. Kowalski turned and looked at the four 88mm guns sitting in their sandbag positions. The weapons that had killed Mickey, the weapons that could kill tigers, the weapons that, according to every regulation and common sense, his platoon could never operate. The tigers were at 800 yards in closing. He could hear the diesel engines now, that distinctive coughing roar that sounded like industrial machinery trying to clear its throat. In about 4 minutes, they'd be at effective range. In 6 minutes, his platoon would be dead. Decision time. Every man on that ridge was looking at Kowalski, waiting for the order to retreat, to dig in, to do something. Their eyes were begging him for a solution that didn't exist. But maybe it did exist. Maybe the solution was sitting in plain sight, wrapped in German steel and precision engineering, waiting for someone crazy enough or desperate enough to try. Kowalski jumped down into the gun pit next to Wolfstrain, the weapon that had killed his best friend. He put his hand on the traverse wheel, felt the cold metal under his palm. He looked at the massive breech block, at the complex mechanisms, at the German instructions he couldn't read. Sullivan was shouting at him, "Wrench, what are you doing? We need to move." Kowalski didn't answer. He was thinking about his father standing next to a broken tractor. He was thinking about 2 millimeters of misalignment that professionals had missed. He was thinking about how every complex problem is just a collection of simple problems pretending to be impossible. He looked up at his platoon, at 23 terrified men who deserved better than dying on a nameless ridge. "We're not running," Kowalski said. His voice was steady calm, like he was discussing how to fix a Jeep. "We're going to shoot them." "With what?" Sullivan's voice cracked with stress. Kowalski patted the breech of the 88. "With this." The silence that followed was profound. Every man stared at him like he'd lost his mind. Maybe he had. Maybe 3 weeks of grief and rage had finally broken something in his brain. Or maybe, just maybe, he'd figured out something that everyone else had missed. "Sarge," Tommy Briggs said carefully, like talking to someone on a ledge, "we don't know how to fire that thing. It's got computers and all kinds of complicated stuff. We're not trained." Kowalski grabbed the heavy steel handle on the breech block. It was cold and greasy, and it resisted his first pull. He put his shoulder into it, grunting with effort. With a metallic clunk that sounded like a vault opening, the breech block slid down. The chamber lay open, a dark, hungry mouth waiting to be fed. "I don't care about the computers," Kowalski said. He looked through the barrel from the breech end, seeing a circle of daylight at the far end. "It's a gun. It has a hole at one end and a trigger at the other. We're going to figure it out." The tigers were at 600 yards now. Kowalski could see them clearly without binoculars. 3 mechanical monsters coming to reclaim their territory. Coming to kill everyone on this ridge. He had maybe 3 minutes to learn what German gunners spent 6 months training for. 3 minutes to become an artillery expert. 3 minutes to save 23 lives with a weapon he had only seen in manuals. His hands were shaking as he climbed into the gunner's seat. The controls looked impossibly complex. Gauges and dials and hand wheels and foot pedals. German text everywhere. But underneath all that complexity, underneath all the fancy engineering, was something simple. A tube, a trigger, a target. And William Kowalski, farm kid from Kansas, tractor mechanic turned infantry sergeant, was about to teach the Wehrmacht that sometimes complexity is just intimidation wearing a German uniform. The tigers were at 500 yards in closing when Kowalski put his foot on the firing pedal for the first time. The metal was cold through his boot. His leg was shaking. The entire world had narrowed down to this moment, this impossible task, this desperate gamble. "Someone get me a shell," he said quietly. "The big ones with the pointy tips." And that's when the real learning began. 450 yards. The tigers were close enough now that Kowalski could see the mud caked on their spare track links. Close enough to make out the commander standing in the open hatch of the lead tank, binoculars raised, scanning the ridge for targets. The German officer looked confident, relaxed even. He had no reason to think the Americans could hurt him. That was about to change. Private Jimmy Chen scrambled into the gun pit, nearly falling in his haste. Chen was 20 years old, born in San Francisco, to parents who ran a watch repair shop, until the government decided that anyone with Japanese ancestry, even Chinese Americans, was a potential threat. His family was in an internment camp in Colorado. Chen had volunteered for the army to prove his loyalty, to show that his last name didn't define which side he was on. Right now, his hands were full of a German logbook, leather-bound and covered in neat handwriting. He'd taken it from one of the dead gunners. His eyes were moving rapidly across the pages, his lips forming silent words as he tried to translate. "I found their manual," Chen said, breathless. "Some of its technical diagrams. I can make out the basic loading sequence." Kowalski didn't take his eyes off the Tigers. 375 yards now. "Tell me how to open this thing and put a shell in it. Everything else is noise." Chen flipped through pages, found a diagram showing the breech mechanism and cross-section. "Okay, the breech is already open. Good. We need an armor-piercing round. Should have a black tip and brass casing. The high-explosive ones have yellow bands. Those won't do anything to a Tiger." Corporal Sullivan was already at the ammunition crates, sorting through shells that weighed 40 pounds each. He found one with the black tip, hefted it like a man lifting a small child. "This one, that's it," Chen confirmed. He was reading faster now, running his finger down the German text. "It says here you insert the round into the chamber nose first and push it all the way back until it clicks into the extractor. Then get your hands out fast because the breech block is spring-loaded. It'll slam shut on automatically and it can crush bone." Tommy Briggs helped Sullivan carry the shell to the gun. The kid was terrified. Kowalski could see it in every movement, but he was still functioning, still doing his job. That was all you could ask. "Load it," Kowalski said. Sullivan and Tommy positioned the round at the chamber opening. The shell was 3 feet long, heavy, awkward. They pushed it in, straining with the weight. The nose of the projectile disappeared into the darkness of the barrel. They shoved harder, arms trembling, until they heard a metallic click. The breech block slammed upward with a sound like a car door closing at high speed. Both men yanked their hands back. Tommy looked at his fingers, counting them to make sure they were all still attached. "Guns loaded," Sullivan said. His voice had the flat affect of a man who'd stopped processing fear and moved into pure mechanical function. The Tigers were at 350 yards. They'd slowed down slightly, the commanders conferring over radio, probably coordinating their assault. They still weren't shooting. They were taking their time. Why rush when your targets couldn't hurt you? Kowalski stared at the control wheels in front of him. The traverse wheel on the left would swing the gun horizontally. The elevation wheel on the right would raise or lower the barrel. Both were marked with German graduations that meant nothing to him. He grabbed the elevation wheel and started cranking. The massive barrel began to descend. It moved slowly, reluctantly, the gears fighting him. The gun had been pointing at the sky, set for anti-aircraft work. He was lowering it to point at the ground, to point it to tanks, to use it in a way it hadn't been designed for but had become famous for. He cranked faster. The barrel came down degree by degree until it was nearly horizontal, pointing straight out toward the approaching armor. It looked wrong, somehow predatory, like a creature that had been forced into an unnatural position. Now came the hard part: aiming. The optical sight mounted on the side of the gun was a beautiful piece of German engineering, all brass and glass and carefully calibrated crosshairs. Kowalski pressed his eye to the rubber cup and saw nothing useful. The sight was designed for tracking aircraft miles away. At 300 yards, looking for a ground target, it was like trying to read a book through a telescope. Useless. He pulled back from the sight and cursed. The Tigers were at 320 yards. He could hear their machine guns, now short bursts of suppression fire, kicking up dirt around the American positions. They were softening up the ridge before the final assault. Chen was watching him, understanding dawning on his face. "You can't use the sight, can you? It's calibrated for the wrong range, wrong type of target." Kowalski's mind was racing, trying to remember everything he'd learned from his father, from fixing machines, from those nights studying the German manual. There had to be a way. And then it hit him. The oldest trick in the book. The method that had existed since the first caveman pointed a stick at something and threw a rock along it. Bore sighting. "Open the breech," Kowalski shouted. Chen grabbed the lever and threw it. The breech block swung down, revealing the empty chamber, and beyond it the entire length of the barrel. A 30-foot steel tube, rifled and precise, with a circle of daylight at the far end. Kowalski jumped out of the gunner's seat and ran to the back of the gun. He shoved Chen aside and put his face right up to the open breech. Looking straight down the barrel from the rear, he could see through the tube like looking through a pipe. At the far end, framed in that perfect circle of light, he saw the muddy field. He saw the tree line, and he saw gray steel. He grabbed the traverse wheel from the side of the gun, spinning it while keeping one eye pressed to the breech. The world inside the barrel shifted. Trees slid past, a destroyed Jeep slid past, and then the circle of light was filled with the angular shape of a Tiger tank. The lead tank was centered perfectly in the bore, so close now that Kowalski could see individual details. The commander had dropped into the turret and closed his hatch. The barrel of the 88mm gun mounted on the tank was traversing hunting. "Load another round," Kowalski yelled, jumping back into the gunner's seat. He locked the traverse wheel in place. "Same type, black tip." Sullivan and Tommy were already moving. They developed a rhythm, working together to manhandle the heavy shells. The round went in, the breech slammed shut. The gun was live. Kowalski put his foot on the firing pedal. It was a simple steel plate connected to the firing mechanism by a mechanical linkage. No electronics, no computers, just leverage and springs and a hammer waiting to strike a primer. The Tigers were at 300 yards. The lead tank fired. Kowalski saw the muzzle flash, saw the smoke bloom, and then the world exploded 10 feet in front of the gun pit. The shell hit the dirt berm, protecting the position, detonating on impact. A wall of earth and sandbags was thrown into the air. The concussion wave slapped Kowalski's face, sucked the air from his lungs. Debris rained down, mud and rocks and shredded sandbag material. Sullivan was shouting something, but Kowalski's ears were ringing too loud to hear the words. He wiped mud from his eyes, blinked away the spots in his vision. The gun was still functional. The barrel was clear. He had one shot before the German gunner corrected his aim and put the next round directly into the pit. He didn't have time to think about ballistics or wind drift or the fact that he'd never fired an artillery piece in his life. He had maybe 5 seconds before that Tiger reloaded and killed everyone in this position. Kowalski stomped on the firing pedal. He didn't just press it, he kicked it with every ounce of fear and desperation in his body, drove his boot down like he was trying to break through the steel plate and hit the mechanism underneath. The gun responded instantly. The sound was not what he expected. It wasn't a boom. It was a thunderclap snap, a physical rupture of air pressure that felt like getting slapped across the face by an invisible hand. A tongue of flame 10 feet long erupted from the muzzle brake, so bright in the gray morning that it left after images in his vision. The 9,000-pound gun leaped backward on its wheels. The recoil spades, those steel legs that were supposed to be dug into the ground to absorb the shock, tore furrows 2 feet long in the frozen mud. The entire weapon slid back like it had been hit by a truck. Kowalski was thrown against the metal seat back. His spine compressed. His teeth clacked together. The world turned white for a split second, pure sensory overload, and then sound came back in a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. He couldn't hear, couldn't see clearly, but he could make out shapes through the smoke and dust. The Tiger was still there, still moving, which meant he'd missed. The shell had left the barrel at 2,600 feet per second. At 300 yards, the flight time was effectively zero. But Kowalski hadn't accounted for the recoil twist, hadn't known that the gun would jump up and to the left as it fired. The round had screamed past the Tiger's turret, missing the steel by inches, and slammed into a massive oak tree in the background. The tree didn't splinter. It vaporized. The trunk simply ceased to exist in a cloud of wood chips and pulverized bark. Branches fell in slow motion. A cloud of sawdust hung in the air like fog. Sullivan was screaming at him. Kowalski could see his mouth moving, see the cords standing out in his neck, but he couldn't hear the words over the ringing in his ears. He didn't need to hear them. He knew what Sullivan was saying. "You missed." The German commander in the lead Tiger must have been shocked. He'd probably expected return fire from rifles, maybe a bazooka, if the Americans were feeling suicidal. But an 88mm round coming back at him. That wasn't supposed to happen. American infantry didn't operate captured artillery. The Tiger's turret stopped traversing. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the massive vehicle lurched into motion, backing up, the commander trying to put distance between himself and whatever madness was happening on that ridge. But the other two Tigers were still coming. They split formation. Tiger 2 breaking left toward the tree line, Tiger 3 moving right to flank. They were adjusting tactics, treating this like a real threat instead of a cleanup operation. Kowalski's hands were shaking as he tried to assess what had gone wrong. The bore sighting had put the target in the line of fire. He was certain of that. but the gun had jumped when it fired, twisting the aim at the last microsecond. He needed to compensate. "Reload," he croaked. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, muffled and distant. "Hurry!" Chen had already selected another armor-piercing round. Tommy and Sullivan grabbed at their movements faster now, born from repetition. They knew the dangers. They knew where to put their hands and when to pull back. The shell went in. The breech slammed. 8 seconds from empty to loaded. The lead Tiger had stopped backing up. The commander was probably on the radio calling for instructions, trying to understand what was happening. The turret started rotating again, that long 88mm gun barrel swinging to bear on Kowalski's position. This was it. The race. The German loader in that tank was ramming a shell into his breech. Kowalski had maybe 6 seconds before that gun fired again. And this time the German gunner wouldn't aim high. He'd drop the round right into the pit. Kowalski cranked the traverse wheel, adjusting his aim. He'd missed to the right because the gun twisted left. So aim right. Basic physics. The gun had jumped up. So aim low. He made the adjustments by feel, by instinct, by the same intuition that had let him find a 2mm misalignment in a tractor engine. He looked down the side of the barrel, not through any sight, just eyeballing the angle like he was pointing his finger at something. The Tiger filled his vision. He could see the texture of the Zimmerit paste, could see the spare tracks mounted on the hull, could see the weak point where the turret met the body, that junction, where steel plates came together in a ring of bolts. The turret, ring, the throat of the beast. He took a breath, held it. The world narrowed to this moment. His foot hovered over the pedal. The Tiger's gun was almost lined up, almost ready, almost. Kowalski stomped. The gun roared again. Same violent whip crack of displaced air, same 10-foot flame, same brutal recoil throwing him back against the seat. But this time the connection was solid. This time he felt it in his bones, knew it before he could see it. The armor-piercing shell left the barrel in a perfectly straight line. No arc, no drop. At this range, gravity was irrelevant. The round covered 300 yards in 0.3 of a second and hit the Tiger's turret ring with the force of a meteor strike. Sullivan, watching from the edge of the pit with his jaw hanging open, would later describe what happened next as the most beautiful and terrible thing he'd ever seen. The shell didn't just penetrate the armor, it destroyed the very concept of armor. The hardened steel tip hit the junction where the turret bolted to the hull, that one vertical weakness is in the Tiger's slope protection. The bolts, each one 3 inches thick, sheared off instantly. The entire turret, all 11 tons of it, lifted straight up into the air. It rose 3 feet, propelled by the explosion inside the crew compartment. For a moment that seemed frozen in time, the massive steel dome hung there, disconnected from the tank, the long gun barrel pointing uselessly at the sky. Then physics reasserted itself. The turret flipped backward in a lazy arc and crashed down onto the rear engine deck, with a sound like a church bell being dropped from a building. Fire erupted from the open hole where the turret used to be. A pillar of flame 20 feet high, fed by ammunition cooking off in sequence. The hull of the tank rocked with internal explosions. Black smoke boiled into the morning air. Tommy Briggs fell to his knees and vomited into the mud. The kid had held it together through the loading, through the firing, but seeing the result, understanding that 5 human beings had just died in that steel coffin, was too much. He retched again, dry heaving, his whole body shaking. Chen stood perfectly still, his face blank, processing what he'd just witnessed. Sullivan was breathing hard, hands on his knees, looking at Kowalski with something between awe and fear. Kowalski sat in the gunner's seat motionless. His hands were still gripping the traverse wheels so hard his knuckles had gone white. He was staring at the burning Tiger, at the smoke, at the visual evidence that he'd just killed 5 men he'd never met. The morning air smelled like burning diesel and cooked meat. The wind carried black smoke across the ridge. Somewhere in the wreckage of that tank, 5 German soldiers were dead. They'd had names, families, hopes for after the war. And in a fraction of a second, Kowalski had erased all of that. This wasn't like shooting at distant shapes, wasn't like calling in artillery coordinates. This was direct, personal. He'd pointed the weapon. He'd pulled the trigger. He owned this death. Sullivan grabbed his shoulder, shook him hard enough to rattle his teeth. "Bill? 2 more tanks. Focus." Kowalski blinked, coming back to himself. Sullivan was right. The other tigers were still out there. Tiger 2 had disappeared into the tree line on the right flank. Tiger 3 was laying down smoke, obscuring itself behind a gray chemical fog. They weren't charging anymore. They just watched their platoon leader get decapitated by a weapon that shouldn't be in American hands, operated by soldiers who should know how to use it. They were reassessing, adapting, getting smart. How many rounds do we have left? Kowalski's voice came out steady, almost calm. Some part of him had shut down, pushed the horror into a box he'd deal with later. Right now, there were still threats, still problems to solve. Chen checked the ammunition crates. 4 armor-piercing rounds left. We've got plenty of high explosive, but those won't penetrate Tiger armor. 4 rounds, 2 targets. The math was simple, but the execution would be anything but. The Tigers knew they were in danger now. They wouldn't make the same mistake of presenting easy targets. Tiger 2 revealed its strategy first. Instead of coming out into the open, it stayed deep in the tree line. Kowalski could hear the engine but couldn't see the tank. Then a tree at the edge of the woods exploded, blown apart by a high-explosive shell. The Tiger was clearing lanes of fire, using its gun to cut down obstacles. The tree toppled, crashing to the forest floor, and in the gap it left, Kowalski could see the gray hull sitting in shadows. The tank was hull down in a natural depression. Only the turret was visible, presenting the thickest armor at the most protected angle. It was a textbook defensive position, the kind of thing you'd see in a training manual about proper armor tactics. And it meant Kowalski had no shot. The turret front was curved massively thick. His armor-piercing round would ricochet off it like a stone skipping on water. "Can't penetrate from this angle," he said, thinking out loud. "Need to hit the hull or the side armor, but it's buried in that ravine." Sullivan was watching the tree line, trying to spot the third Tiger. "So what do? We can't just sit here. That thing has us zeroed. It's going to start dropping rounds on our heads." Kowalski's mind raced through options. They couldn't reposition the gun fast enough, couldn't move to a better angle, couldn't wait for the tank to expose itself because it had no reason to move from its perfect position. But he didn't need to kill the tank. Not yet. He needed to blind it, buy time, create opportunities. "I'm going to shoot the ground," Kowalski said. Sullivan stared at him. "What?" "The dirt in front of the tank. Create a dust screen. If it can't see us, it can't aim. That's wasting ammunition we don't have. It's buying time we need more." Kowalski adjusted his aim, pointing the barrel low, targeting a spot 15 yards in front of where the Tiger was hull down. He was guessing at the distance, estimating based on tree heights and shadows. No precision instruments, just eyeballs and experienced fixing machines. "Load," he ordered. The team moved. Shell in, breech closed, gun ready. The Tigers were at 200 yards now, close enough that Kowalski could make out individual details through gaps in the foliage. Close enough to die. He fired. The shell impacted dirt and detonated. The explosion threw up a curtain of soil and rocks and pulverized vegetation. A wall of debris 15 feet high, hanging in the air like a brown thundercloud. The Tiger disappeared behind it, completely obscured. The German gunner fired back, blind shooting through the dust screen. His shell whistled overhead, missing by 10 feet, the wind of its passage strong enough to knock Tommy flat. The kid scrambled behind the gun shield, wild-eyed, breathing in short gasps that might have been the start of panic. "Stay with me, Briggs," Kowalski said, keeping his voice level. "We need you." The dust was already starting to settle, blown by the wind. Kowalski had maybe 15 seconds before the Tiger could see clearly again. He cranked the elevation wheel, raising the barrel a fraction. He was aiming blind now, visualizing where the turret should be, based on where he'd last seen it, hoping the tank hadn't moved. "Load," he said again. Another round. Another slam of the breech. The gun was getting hot now. Kowalski could feel the heat radiating from the barrel, could smell burning oil from the recoil mechanism. He fired through the dissipating dust. The shell screamed across the gap and hit the Tiger's turret mantlet, that thick curved shield protecting the gun mount. The round struck at a steep angle and ricocheted, spinning off into the sky with a sound like a giant playing a broken violin string. Sparks flew from the impact point, but no penetration, no kill. "Missed," Sullivan said unnecessarily. Kowalski knew he'd missed, could feel it. The angle had been too steep. He'd aimed too high, trying to hit the turret. What he needed was a flat shot into the hull. but the hull was protected by the terrain. The Tiger's engine roared. It was coming out of its hole. The commander had made a decision. Sitting in a defensive position wasn't working. The Americans had some kind of miracle weapon and a lunatic willing to use it. Time to go on the offense. Time to close the distance and finish this. The massive tank lurched forward, climbing out of the depression. Mud flew from its tracks. The engine screamed under the load of pushing 60 tons up an incline. It broke through the tree line, smashing saplings flat, accelerating. 40 yards, 35, 30. The Tiger wasn't stopping to shoot. It was coming to ram them, to crush the gun position under its tracks, to grind the Americans into the mud like insects. Tommy had dropped his shell and was running. Just running, blind panic taking over. Sullivan tackled him, dragged him back. "Load the gun or we all die. Load!" The kid was crying, tears streaming down his face, but his hands were moving. Training overrode fear. Muscle memory kicked in. He grabbed the last armor-piercing round with Sullivan's help. Together, they manhandled it to the breach. 25 yards. The Tiger filled Kowalski's entire field of vision. He could see the driver's vision port, could see the bow machine gun, could see death approaching at 20 miles per hour. The round went in. The breech slammed. Kowalski's foot was already moving toward the pedal, but he didn't fire. Not yet. His hands were on the traverse wheel, making tiny adjustments, tracking the moving target. The Tiger was accelerating, building speed, confident in its armor and momentum. 20 yards. Kowalski could hear individual track links clanking, could smell the diesel exhaust. 15 yards. The gun barrel of the Tiger was lowering, preparing to fire at point-blank range. 10 yards. Sullivan was screaming something. Chen had his hands over his ears. Tommy was praying in rapid Spanish. And then the Tiger hit a drainage ditch, one of those small channels cut into the field for water runoff. Nothing dramatic, just a depression 2 feet deep. But for a split second, as the nose of the tank dipped down into that ditch, the angle changed. The glacis plate that sloped frontal armor that was normally angled to deflect shells flattened out. The driver's plate, the vertical steel protecting the man steering the beast, presented itself at 90 degrees to Kowalski's gun. A window of opportunity 7/10 of a second wide. Kowalski didn't think, didn't calculate, didn't breathe. 20 years of fixing machines, of understanding how metal moved and weight shifted and momentum carried, all condensed into pure instinct. He stomped the pedal. The shell covered 10 yards faster than thought. It hit the driver's plate, dead center, punched through the 100-millimeter armor like it was cardboard, and carried all its kinetic energy into the cramped crew compartment. The Tiger stopped. Not gradually, not with braking. It stopped like it had hit an invisible wall. The momentum carried it forward another 5 feet, track still turning, and then the engine died. Smoke poured from every hatch and vision slit. The massive vehicle settled into the mud, silent, except for the crackling of fire inside. It came to rest 20 yards from the gun pit, close enough that Kowalski could have thrown a rock and hit it. The silence that followed was profound. No engine noise, no gunfire, just the wind and the crackle of burning tanks and the high-pitched whine of tinnitus in Kowalski's ears. He sat in the gunner's seat, his foot still pressed against the pedal, his hands still gripping the wheels. He couldn't seem to let go. His muscles had locked up. His brain had stopped sending signals to his body. Sullivan climbed into the pit and physically pulled Kowalski's hands off the controls. Bill, let go. It's done. You got them both." Kowalski looked at him blankly. 2 Tigers burning, 10 men dead. By his hand. By his decisions. He'd learned to operate the weapon in 15 minutes. Had taught himself to kill with German precision using American stubbornness. But there was still one Tiger out there. Tiger 3. The one that had laid smoke and disappeared. "Where's the third one?" Kowalski asked. His voice sounded hollow, like it was coming from someone else. Chen was scanning the field with the binoculars, searching for any sign of the missing tank. "I don't... Wait, there. Movement in the tree line southwest." Kowalski forced himself to stand to look where Chen was pointing. He could see dust rising through the trees, hear an engine, but it was getting quieter. Moving away. Tiger 3 was retreating. The commander had watched 2 tanks die in minutes, had seen a weapon that shouldn't be in American hands operated by soldiers who shouldn't know how, and had made the smart decision. Pull back, regroup, call for help. Should we shoot? Sullivan asked. We've still got HE rounds. Might not kill it, but we could damage it. Kowalski shook his head slowly. Let it go. What? Why won? Because we won. We held the position. We saved the platoon. Kowalski climbed out of the gun pit on shaky legs. I don't need to kill anyone else today. He walked toward the closest burning Tiger, the first one he'd hit. The turret was still lying upside down on the engine deck, the long gun barrel pointing at nothing. Black smoke poured from the hull. The smell was indescribable. Burning fuel and burning rubber and burning things that had been human. Tommy appeared at his elbow holding something. A photograph singed at the edges that must have fallen from the tank during the explosion. It showed a German family, a man in uniform, a woman, two small children. On the back, written in fading ink, Klaus kam sicher nach Haus. Klaus come home safely. Kowalski took the photograph with numb fingers. He stared at it for a long moment at the faces of people he'd just made into widows and orphans. Then he folded it carefully and put it in his breast pocket right next to Mickey Cordero's melted dog tags. I'm sorry, he whispered to the burning tank. I'm so sorry. But sorry didn't change anything. Sorry didn't bring anyone back. Sorry was just a word you said to make yourself feel less like a monster. The sound of engines came from the west this time. Different engines. Radial engines. American engines. The relief column that was supposed to arrive at 1400 hours had somehow made it early. 5 Sherman tanks crested the ridge behind them, followed by half-tracks full of infantry. A young captain jumped from the lead jeep, clean uniform, polished boots, the look of someone who'd been in the rear and hadn't seen what war actually looked like. He walked toward the gun position, his eyes getting wider with each step. He looked at the 2 destroyed Tigers, at the smoking wrecks that had been the most feared tanks in the German arsenal, at the 88mm gun, its barrel still radiating heat, at the 4 exhausted soldiers standing in the pit like they'd just fought their way out of hell. Sergeant, the captain said, his voice careful, who killed those tanks? Sullivan pointed at Kowalski. He did, sir. With that German gun, no training, no fire control computer. Just bore sighting and guts. The captain stared at Kowalski like he was looking at an alien. That's not possible. You'd need a trained crew. You'd need specialized equipment. I needed to not die, sir, Kowalski interrupted. His voice was flat, emotionless. That was all the training I needed. The relief columns spread out across the ridge. Medics tended to the wounded. Engineers examined the captured guns. An intelligence officer started taking photographs, already thinking about the report he'd write, the investigation he'd launch. But Kowalski wasn't paying attention to any of it. He was looking at his hands. They were blistered from gripping hot metal, shaking from adrenaline crash, covered in mud and powder residue, and probably tiny specks of things he didn't want to think about. These were the hands that had fixed tractors in Kansas, had loaded shells in Germany, had killed 10 men in 15 minutes. He wondered if they'd ever feel clean again. The relief column brought order to chaos. Engineers set up a perimeter. Medics treated minor wounds, exhaustion, shock. Radio operators established communication with battalion headquarters. The ridge that had been a desperate last stand 20 minutes ago was now just another secured position on the long, bloody road through Germany. But for William Kowalski, the battle wasn't over. It had just moved inside his head. He sat on the edge of the gun pit, his rifle across his knees, watching the Tigers burn. The flames had died down to a dull orange glow. The smoke had turned from black to gray. Inside those steel coffins, human beings had become ash and memory. He'd done that. His finger on the trigger, his eye on the target, his responsibility. Tommy Briggs sat next to him, not talking, just existing in the same space. The kid had aged 10 years in the last hour. His hands were still shaking. Every few minutes, he'd look at the tanks, then look away quickly, like he'd seen something he couldn't process. Sullivan was giving his report to the captain, describing the engagement in clipped military language. 3 enemy armor units, 2 destroyed, 1 withdrew, no American casualties, a complete tactical victory. The words sounded clean, professional. They had nothing to do with the reality of what had happened. Chen was helping the engineers examine the captured guns. His mechanical knowledge, his ability to translate German technical documents, made him valuable in a way that had nothing to do with his ancestry. For a few hours, he could just be a soldier helping his unit, not a suspect in his own country. The intelligence officer, a lieutenant with thick glasses and a notebook, approached Kowalski carefully, the way you'd approach a wounded animal, something dangerous that might lash out. Sergeant Kowalski, the lieutenant's voice was cautious. I need to ask you some questions about the engagement, for the record. Kowalski didn't look at him. Sure. How did you know how to operate the 88? Had you received specialized training? No. Did you have access to technical manuals, translation support? Had a German manual, couldn't read it, just looked at the pictures. The lieutenant wrote something in his notebook, and you achieved 2 confirmed kills against Tiger tanks with no formal training. 3 shots, 2 hits, 1 miss. Math's not complicated. But the complexity of the weapon system alone should have made operation impossible without extensive. Kowalski finally looked at the lieutenant. His eyes must have shown something because the officer stopped talking. Mid-sentence took a step back. You want to know how I did it? Kowalski's voice was quiet but had an edge like broken glass. I didn't think. I just pointed the biggest gun I could find at the biggest threat I could see and pulled the trigger. That's the whole story. That's the great mystery. Sorry it's not more complicated for your report. The lieutenant cleared his throat. The battalion commander wants to recommend you for the Medal of Honor. This is an extraordinary action. You saved your entire unit using enemy equipment in a way that military doctrine says is impossible. I don't want a medal. Sergeant, you don't understand. I understand perfectly. Yesha Kowalski stood up, towering over the smaller man. I killed 10 people today. 10 human beings who woke up this morning thinking they'd live to see tomorrow. I'm not a hero. I'm just a guy who didn't die. There's a difference. He walked away before the lieutenant could respond. He needed to move, needed to do something with his hands. Standing still meant thinking, and thinking meant seeing those turrets fly off and smelling that smell, and hearing sounds that his mind kept trying to replay on loop. The first Tiger, the one he'd hit in the turret ring, had finally stopped burning. The metal had cooled enough to approach. Kowalski walked toward it, drawn by morbid curiosity or guilt, or something he didn't have words for. Sullivan saw him and jogged over. Bill, don't. There's nothing good in there. I need to see. No, you don't. Trust me. I've seen burned out tanks before. It's not. But Kowalski was already moving. He climbed onto the hull, his boots sliding on metal, still warm to the touch. The turret had left a gaping hole where it had been torn free. He looked down into the crew compartment. Sullivan was right. There was nothing good there. Nothing human anymore. Just shapes that had been people fused to metal by heat that turned steel into taffy. He could see where the loader had been standing, where the gunner had been sitting. The commander's position near the hatch. Klaus, the name from the photograph. Maybe one of these shapes was Klaus, who had a family waiting in Germany, who'd wanted to come home safely, who'd never make it now because a Kansas farm boy had learned to shoot his own weapon better than he could. Kowalski felt his stomach lurch. He turned away quickly, climbed down, walked 20 feet before his legs gave out, and he fell to his knees in the mud. He didn't throw up. He just knelt there, breathing hard, trying to push the images out of his head and failing. Tommy found him like that 10 minutes later. The kids sat down next to him close enough that their shoulders touched. Neither of them said anything. What was there to say they'd survived? Others hadn't. That was the whole story of war in 2 sentences. My mama wrote me a letter, Tommy finally said. Got it 2 days ago. She said she prays for me every night, prays that I'll come home with my soul still intact. I didn't really understand what she meant until today. Kowalski nodded slowly. Do you think we're going to hell for this? Tommy's voice was small. For killing them? I don't know, maybe, probably. But they would have killed us. I know. So it was us or them. I know that too. Then why do we feel like I did something wrong? Kowalski didn't have an answer. He was 24 years old. He'd been fixing tractors 3 years ago. Nobody had prepared him for the moral calculus of survival. Nobody had explained that doing the right thing could feel so much like doing the wrong thing. The sound of approaching vehicles pulled them back to reality. More trucks, more men, a colonel's jeep. The story of what had happened was spreading through the battalion. Word had reached regimental headquarters. Now the brass wanted to see the miracle weapon and the miracle worker who'd used it. Colonel Mitchell climbed out of his Jeep, a career officer with 30 years in the Army and a chest full of medals from the last war. He looked at the Tigers, at the gun at Kowalski, and shook his head in what might have been admiration or disbelief or both. "Sergeant Kowalski," Mitchell said. It wasn't a question. Everyone knew his name by now. Kowalski stood, came to a loose attention. "Sir, I'm told you single-handedly destroyed 2 Tiger tanks with a captured German anti-aircraft gun, that you had no training on the weapon system, that you improvised the entire engagement based on mechanical intuition. I had help, sir, my whole team. But you were the gunner." "Yes, sir." Mitchell walked a slow circle around the 88, examining it like a curious artifact. "How did you know it would work?" "I didn't, sir, but sitting still would have got us killed for sure. So I tried. And bore sighting, that was your innovation." "Old hunting trick, sir. My grandfather taught me." "Your grandfather?" Mitchell laughed, a sharp bark of sound. "So American military doctrine is being rewritten by a sergeant who learned artillery tactics from his grandfather on a farm in Kansas." "I don't think it's doctrine, sir. I think it's desperation." Mitchell stopped walking and looked at Kowalski directly. "The Army is going to study this engagement. They're going to write manuals. They're going to try to teach other soldiers what you did here. But between you and me, Sergeant, do you think what you did today is replicable?" Kowalski thought about the manual he had studied, the mechanical knowledge from fixing machines, the pressure of imminent death, the luck of hitting that turret ring on the second shot, the luck of the Tiger dipping into a ditch at exactly the right moment, the luck of not dying in the first 30 seconds. "No, sir, I don't think you can teach this. I think you can only survive it." Mitchell nodded like he'd expected that answer. "I'm recommending you for the Silver Star. You'll probably get it. And I'm also recommending that you and your team get rotated to the rear for a week. Rest, hot food, no combat. You've earned it." "Thank you, sir." But even as he said it, Kowalski knew a week in the rear wouldn't help. You couldn't rest your way out of what he'd seen. Couldn't eat your way past what he'd done. The images were permanent now, scratched into his brain like graffiti on a wall. He'd carry them for however long he lived. The colonel left. The engineers started preparing to tow the captured guns back to American lines. The 88s would be repainted, marked with white stars used against their former owners. Wolfstrain would kill again, just under a different flag. Sullivan organized the platoon for evacuation. They'd lost 3 men wounded in the initial assault, but none in the tank battle. 23 men had walked onto this ridge. 23 would walk off. By the brutal mathematics of war, that counted as a miracle. As the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist, Kowalski took one last look at the gun position. The brass shell casings were still scattered in the pit, 6 of them, each one 3 feet long, physical evidence of what had happened. He picked one up, felt the weight of it, the residual warmth. This piece of metal had changed the day, had saved lives, had taken lives. He set it down carefully and climbed out of the pit. The march back to friendly lines took 4 hours. Nobody talked much. Exhaustion and emotional overload had rendered them all temporarily mute. They walked in loose formation, weapons ready, but not expecting contact. The German retreat had opened a gap in their lines. They passed through 2 more American units on the way back. Both times, word had already spread. Soldiers pointed, whispered, "That's the guy. That's the one who killed tigers with their own gun." Kowalski kept his head down and kept walking. By nightfall, they reached a rear area staging camp. Hot food, clean water, tents with actual cots instead of frozen mud. It should have felt like paradise after weeks of frontline combat. Instead, it felt hollow, empty. Kowalski lay on his cot, staring at the canvas roof of the tent, listening to other men snore. Sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the turret lifting off, saw the driver's plate at that perfect angle, saw the photograph of Klaus's family. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the photo, looked at it in the dim light. The woman was pretty. The children were maybe 5 and 7 years old. They'd grow up without a father because of him. They'd be told he died serving Germany. Would probably never know the details. Would probably imagine it was quick and painless. It hadn't been painless. Kowalski knew that. The crew would have had maybe 2 seconds of awareness between impact and death. 2 seconds of knowing their armor had failed them. 2 seconds of terminal understanding. Not long enough to pray, just long enough to know. He almost threw the photo away a dozen times, but he couldn't. It felt like a responsibility, a witness. He folded it back into his pocket next to Mickey's dog tags, his own private museum of the war. The people he'd lost and the people he'd killed kept together in the same space. The days in the rear passed slowly. The Army tried to debrief him properly. Intelligence officers wanted to know every detail of the engagement. They brought German technical manuals, asked him to identify which diagrams he'd used. He pointed at random pictures made up. Half the story told them what they wanted to hear. A major from the Ordnance Department showed up with questions about whether captured weapons could be integrated into American units. Kowalski told him it was a terrible idea. The major wrote it down as if it was wisdom instead of common sense. A chaplain came to talk about the spiritual implications of combat. Kowalski listened politely and said nothing. What could he say? That he felt like he'd traded part of his soul for survival, that he couldn't reconcile the man who fixed tractors with the man who killed 10 people in 15 minutes. The chaplain wouldn't understand. Nobody would unless they'd been there. On the fourth day, Sullivan found him sitting alone behind the mess tent, cleaning his rifle for the third time that day. The rifle didn't need cleaning. It was just something to do with his hands. "You doing okay?" Sullivan asked, though they both knew the answer. "Sure." "You're a terrible liar." Kowalski didn't respond. He ran the cleaning rod through the barrel again, watching the patch come out spotless. Sullivan sat down next to him. "I've been doing this longer than you. North Africa, Sicily, France, now Germany. And I'm going to tell you something that nobody else will say out loud. What you did on that ridge was incredible, saved all our lives. But it's also going to mess you up for a long time, maybe forever." "I know. Do you? Because you're acting like if you just stay busy enough, keep moving enough, you won't have to deal with it. But Bill, you killed 10 men. Good soldiers don't get to just walk away from that. It stays with you." "Then what am I supposed to do?" Sullivan shrugged. "You live with it, you carry it. You figure out how to be a human being again, even though part of you died on that ridge with those Germans. There's no manual for it, no training. You just wake up every day and try to be better than you were yesterday." They sat in silence for a while. Other soldiers passed by, heading to meals or duty shifts or wherever the Army told them to go. None of them had killed 10 men that morning. None of them had the same weight. "I keep thinking about their families," Kowalski finally said. "The wives who are going to get letters. The kids who are going to grow up without fathers. I did that. Me. You also kept Tommy Briggs alive. Kid writes his mother every week. She's got 4 other children depending on her, and she would have lost her oldest son if you hadn't done what you did. You think his family doesn't matter? It's not the same. No, it's not. Nothing about war is the same as anything else. But you don't get to only count the bad parts. You saved 23 American lives. That's not nothing." Kowalski wanted to believe that, wanted to feel like the equation balanced, but it didn't work that way in his head. The dead Germans had faces, now names, families. The saved Americans were just his buddies, people he knew, people who didn't feel like they needed saving because they'd survived. The 7th day came. The rest period ended. New orders arrived. The 1st Infantry Division was moving up to support the push toward the Rhine. Kowalski's platoon would rejoin the line in 48 hours. Back to the mud, back to the fear, back to the possibility of dying on any given morning. But before they left, there was a formation. The entire company assembled in a muddy field behind the camp. Captain Hayes stood at the front with Colonel Mitchell. Kowalski had a bad feeling about what was coming. "Sergeant Kowalski, front and center," Hayes called out. Kowalski walked forward, acutely aware of every eye on him. He stopped in front of the captain, came to attention. Mitchell stepped forward, holding a small box. "Sergeant William Kowalski, for extraordinary heroism in action against enemy forces on 17 November 1944, it is my privilege to award you the Silver Star." The medal came out of the box. Silver Star on a ribbon. It looked small, inadequate, like trying to summarize a novel with a single word. Mitchell pinned it to Kowalski's uniform. "You displayed exceptional courage and innovation under fire." Mitchell continued, his voice carrying across the formation. Your actions directly resulted in the destruction of 2 enemy Tiger tanks and the preservation of American lives. You are a credit to your division and to the United States Army. Applause from the assembled soldiers. Kowalski stood rigid, not feeling any of what he was supposed to feel. Pride, honor. He just felt tired and confused. They were celebrating him for killing people, making a hero out of someone who felt like the opposite of heroic. The formation ended. Soldiers came by to congratulate him, shake his hand, tell him he'd done something amazing. Kowalski accepted it all with a fixed smile that felt like a mask. When it was finally over, he went back to his tent and put the medal in his pack. Didn't look at it again. That night, he wrote a letter to Mickey Cordero's mother in Brooklyn. He'd been putting it off for 3 weeks, not knowing what to say. How do you tell a mother that her son burned to death in a tank, that his last words were screaming for help that never came? In the end, he kept it simple. Mickey died bravely. He saved others with his sacrifice. He is remembered by his brothers in arms. All the standard phrases that meant nothing and everything. He didn't mention the revenge, didn't tell her he'd killed the gun that killed her son. She didn't need to carry that weight too. He sealed the letter and added it to the pile going out with the next mail run. Then he lay on his cot and stared at the canvas ceiling and waited for sleep that wouldn't come. The return to the front line happened on a gray morning that looked like every other gray morning in Germany. They loaded into trucks, bounced along muddy roads, got dropped off in a forest that could have been any forest. The war continued. The war would always continue until it didn't. But something had changed in Kowalski. His platoon could see it even if they couldn't name it. He was quieter, more careful. When they took positions, he didn't just set up defenses. He studied the terrain for every advantage, every possible angle of attack. He looked at abandoned vehicles and equipment with new eyes, seeing potential instead of junk. The manual that had been in his pack, the German technical document he'd studied, now had notes in the margins, sketches, ideas. He'd learned something on that ridge that went beyond firing a gun. He'd learned that innovation came from desperation. That rules were just suggestions when survival was on the line. That understanding how things worked was more valuable than knowing how they were supposed to work. A week after returning to combat, they overran another German position. This one had a mortar team, American mortars, captured weeks earlier. The Germans had been using them against American units. Now the weapons had been recaptured. The platoon was ready to just leave them. But Kowalski stopped, examined the mortars, checked the ammunition, tested the traverse mechanism. "We're taking these," he announced. Sullivan raised an eyebrow. "We don't need more weight to carry. We need firepower, and these work fine. You know how to operate a mortar?" Kowalski smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "I know how to figure things out. That's all you need." They added the mortars to their equipment. 2 days later, when a German machine gun nest pinned them down, Kowalski set up the mortar by memory, and Phil adjusted the angle by watching where the first test round landed and dropped 3 shells directly onto the position. Problem solved. Word spread again. Not the dramatic story of the Tigers, but the quieter reputation of a sergeant who could make anything work, who could look at enemy equipment and see opportunity, who could adapt and improvise and solve problems that should have been impossible. The war ground on. December arrived. The Battle of the Bulge threw everything into chaos. Kowalski's unit found themselves retreating, fighting, advancing, retreating again. The neat front lines dissolved into a confused mess of positions and counterpositions. On Christmas Eve, 1944, they were dug in outside a Belgian village, sharing cold rations and wondering if they'd see morning. Snow was falling. Someone had a harmonica and was playing Silent Night badly. Tommy Briggs was reading letters from home. Kowalski sat apart from the group, his back against a tree, looking at nothing in particular. Sullivan brought him coffee, real coffee someone had scrounged from a supply depot. "Merry Christmas," Sullivan said. "Is it?" Kowalski took the coffee. It was weak and bitter, but hot. "Doesn't feel like it. None of this feels like anything anymore. We're just here, existing, waiting. Waiting for what? For it to end, for us to go home, for whatever comes next." Sullivan sat down next to him. "You know, I've been thinking about that day, the Tigers, what you did." "Don't. No, hear me out. You think you're some kind of monster now, that you're broken or wrong or whatever's going through your head. But Bill, you're not. You're just a guy who was given an impossible situation and found a way through it. That's not evil, that's human. I killed 10 people. In a war, while defending your friends, it's not the same as murder. And you know it. Then why does it feel the same? Sullivan didn't have an answer for that. Because maybe it was supposed to feel the same. Maybe that was the price you'd paid for survival. You got to live, but you had to carry the weight of everyone who didn't. The snow kept falling. Silent night played on. Somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled. The war didn't stop for Christmas. It never stopped for anything. Years later, when people would ask Kowalski about the war, about that day with the Tigers, he would struggle to find words. The story that got told in history books was clean, heroic. A farm boy with mechanical knowledge improvising his way to victory against impossible odds. It made good copy, but the story in his head was different. It was about desperation and luck and the terrible things people could learn when they had no choice. It was about crossing lines you didn't know existed until you'd already crossed them. It was about surviving, but wondering if survival was worth the cost. He would tell people he was just a mechanic who pointed a gun in the right direction, that anyone could have done it, that there was nothing special about him except bad luck and worse timing, and he'd believe it mostly. But late at night, alone with his thoughts, he'd remember the feeling of that firing pedal under his boot, the sound of the gun cracking, the sight of the turret lifting off, and he'd wonder what it said about him that he'd been able to do it at all, that some part of him had adapted so easily to killing, that the same hands that fixed tractors had learned to operate murder with mechanical precision. The war ended eventually. Germany surrendered. Japan surrendered. The shooting stopped. Kowalski came home to Kansas in autumn of 1945, 21 years old and feeling 60. He reopened his father's tractor repair shop. He married a school teacher named Helen in 1947. He had 3 children, Michael named after Mickey Cordero, Sarah, Robert. He lived a quiet life. He never talked about the war, never attended reunions, never sought recognition. When his son asked him what he did during the war, he said he fixed equipment. When his grandchildren asked if he was a hero, he said no heroes were the ones who didn't come home. The Silver Star went in a drawer and stayed there. The photograph of Klaus's family stayed in his wallet until the day he died. A reminder, a witness, a weight he chose to carry because someone had to remember. In 2008, a historian researching the Battle of Hurtgen Forest tracked him down. Kowalski was 84, frail, living in a nursing home. The historian wanted to interview him about the Tiger incident for a documentary. Kowalski agreed on the condition that they didn't make him sound like a hero. The interview lasted 3 hours. The historian asked about tactics and mechanical knowledge and how he'd learned to bore sight and all the technical details that would make good television. Kowalski answered them all, but at the end the historian asked the question no one else had thought to ask. Mr. Kowalski, do you regret what you did that day? Kowalski was quiet for a long time. He looked out the window of the nursing home at the Kansas prairie, at the flat farmland that stretched to the horizon. I regret that Mickey died, he finally said. I regret that Klaus didn't make it home to his family. I regret all of it. But do I regret saving my men? No. I'd do it again. I'd do it 1,000 times. And I'd hate myself for it every single time. That's what war does. It forces you to choose between bad and worse and then makes you live with choosing. Do you think you're a hero? No, heroes are the people who had a choice and chose to sacrifice themselves. I didn't have a choice. I was just trying not to die. Survival isn't heroic. It's just survival. The documentary aired in 2009. It portrayed Kowalski as an American everyman who rose to an impossible challenge. They use phrases like innovative thinking and mechanical genius and extraordinary valor. They showed diagrams of the 88, interviewed military historians who called his bore sighting technique a breakthrough. They never showed the part where he talked about Klaus's photograph, never mentioned the weight he carried for 60 years, never explained that the man who saved 23 lives spent the rest of his life wondering if he'd lost his soul doing it. William Kowalski died in December of 2019, 3 days after his 95th birthday. He was buried in a small cemetery outside Garden City with full military honors. His children and grandchildren were there, a few veterans from other wars. The local VFW posted colors. The headstone was simple at his request. William Kowalski, 1924 to 2019, mechanic father survivor. No mention of the Silver Star. No mention of tigers. No mention of the day that defined his life more than any other. Just the simple fact that he lived and eventually died like everyone else. At the funeral, his oldest grandson read a letter that Kowalski had written to be opened after his death. The letter was short. I spent my life fixing things that were broken. Tractors, machines, problems. But some things can't be fixed. Some things you just carry. War taught me that. It taught me that you can do terrible things for good reasons and good things for terrible reasons. And at the end of the day, you're still the one who did them. I saved lives. I took lives. Both are true. Both matter. And I spent 70 years trying to figure out how to be okay with that. I'm still not sure I managed it, but I tried. That's all any of us can do. Try to be better than we were. Try to fix more than we break. Try to leave something behind that matters more than the worst things we've done. I hope I did. I hope my children and grandchildren know that their grandfather was just a man who tried to do right when nothing felt right. That's the only wisdom I have. There are no heroes in war, just people doing impossible things and hoping they can live with themselves afterward. Choose your impossibilities carefully. And if you can't, if life forces your hand, do what you have to do and forgive yourself for it. Because nobody else will understand. Nobody else can. Love you all. Fix what you can. Carry what you must. And remember that tools don't choose sides. People do. The letter ended there. The grandson folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. That night, a small group gathered at the local VFW hall. Sullivan had died in 1987 from lung cancer, the cigarettes finally catching up to him. Tommy Briggs had been gone since 2003 heart attack while mowing his lawn in Houston. Jimmy Chen had passed just 2 months before Kowalski peacefully in his sleep at 93. Of the original platoon, only 2 remained. They sat at a table with cheap beer and didn't talk much. But one of them, a man named Davis, who'd watched the whole thing from a foxhole 75 years earlier, raised his glass. To wrench, he said simply. To wrench, the other man echoed. They drank, and in the silence that followed, they each remembered the same thing. The sound of a gun that shouldn't have fired. The sight of a turret that shouldn't have lifted. The impossible day when a Kansas mechanic became something else entirely. Not a hero, just a survivor who figured out how to make enemy steel serve American desperation. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was all any of them could ever be. People who did what they had to do and spent the rest of their lives trying to understand why. The war had ended 74 years earlier. But for William Kowalski, it had never really ended at all. It had just moved from outside to inside, from the battlefield to memory, from urgent to chronic. And in the end, that might be the truest story of all. Not about victory or defeat, not about tactics or weapons or innovations, just about the cost. The price you pay for surviving when others don't. The weight you carry when you discover you're capable of things you never imagined. The long, slow process of learning to live with the person war turned you into. Tools don't choose sides, Kowalski had written, but people do, and then they have to live with their choices. That was the lesson. That was the legacy. Not glory, not heroism, just the simple, terrible truth that survival sometimes requires you to become something you never wanted to be. And then you wake up every day and try to be better than that. Try to fix more than you break. Try to remember that underneath the weight, underneath the medals nobody asks about, and the memories nobody wants to hear, you're still just a human being trying to find your way home. Even if home is never quite the same place you left, even if you're never quite the same person who left it. The story ends there, not with triumph, not with tragedy, just with truth. William Kowalski learned to kill dragons with their own fire. And then he learned the harder lesson. How to live with being the kind of person who could do that at all. That's the part they don't put in history books. But it's the part that matters most.